Hi there, everyone, and welcome back to Democracy in 5 Minutes. As usual, I'm Paul Manna, your host here in Williamsburg, Virginia, where I'm a professor of government and public policy at William & Mary. Before we get started here, I wanted to say thanks to everyone who's been tuning in and offering encouragement. Today marks the 10th episode of Democracy in 5 Minutes. It's a small milestone, I'll admit, but I'm still excited to have made it this far, and I hope you all continue to enjoy the show. I always welcome your ideas for future conversations, so please reach out over email if you have any ideas. You can find me at pmanna@wm.edu. For today, I want to continue discussing due process, which we began exploring last week when we addressed what due process means, where it comes from, and why it's important. In that conversation, I said due process is the idea that the government must follow certain procedures when it acts. Today, we'll dig deeper to answer an additional question. Who is entitled to due process in the American democratic system? So let's get rolling on with that important issue. The short answer to today's question is everyone. Everyone is entitled to due process in the American democratic system. That includes people who are U.S. citizens, people who are visiting the U.S., like tourists, people on business, or students from other nations, and even people who are in the country without proper documentation or who entered via illegal means. Where does this broad interpretation of due process come from? In general, it flows from two main sources, and so I'd like to discuss those next. The first source is the law itself. The highest law in the land is the U.S. Constitution, and if we read the words where due process appears, we see phrasing like this. In the Fifth Amendment, it says, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Notice the amendment doesn't say citizen or use some other term. The very broad word person appears. We get further insights from the 14th Amendment, which applies to the states. The key section for today's discussion notes, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Notice in the 14th Amendment, unlike the 5th, the words citizen and person both appear. There are certain privileges and immunities, as the amendment says, that apply to citizens, but not to every person. However, according to the 14th Amendment, every person is entitled to due process. Due process is not one of those privileges and immunities only limited to citizens of the U.S. In court cases, judges at all levels, including the U.S. Supreme Court, have upheld this idea that all people are entitled to due process, especially in cases where the government might detain them or accuse them of a crime. Now, that right to due process doesn't mean that everyone in all instances is entitled to a full-blown trial involving juries and traditional courtrooms as people might imagine them. In immigration specifically, for example, Congress has passed laws to create specialized immigration courts that operate to handle the thousands of cases involving people who are not U.S. citizens who wish to remain in the U.S. but whom the government believes should be removed. Expert immigration judges preside over these cases, but no juries are involved. This is an important detail to remember, given that some critics of due process for non-U.S. citizens have said there would be no time to have the trials for the hundreds of thousands of people they claim are in the U.S. illegally. However, it is possible to provide due process even without a full-blown trial with judges and juries because we have these specialized immigration courts. Overall, then, the law is very clear. All persons who are in the U.S., whether legally or not, are entitled to due process. The second source for this broad application of due process is rooted in logic, and this idea picks up on a thread from last week's episode. It goes something like this. Even if you believed it were most important to give due process to U.S. citizens, you still would need to give due process to all persons to uphold that goal. The reason is that law enforcement officials are human and they can make mistakes. In the U.S., we don't simply take the government's word for it when they apprehend someone claiming they are dangerous and in the country illegally. We have processes that require the government to prove their assertions. As a result, then, if an official from the Department of Homeland Security apprehended someone and said they should be deported, they might be mistaken and actually have a U.S. citizen in custody. And the law doesn't allow the government to deport a U.S. citizen. The only way to know the person's legal status for sure would be to have due process that would enable the person to expose the government's error. In short, even if you were most concerned about the rights of U.S. citizens, you'd still need to ensure that all people, citizens or not, are provided with due process. So, how might this information be useful to you? Consider these two ways. First, someday you might find yourself in a situation in the United States where federal or state government officials are threatening to take away your rights and deprive you of liberty or property. Remember, if that happens, they cannot do so without providing you with due process to challenge their assertions. Second, you can use today's ideas to help you better understand current controversies about due process. Ask yourself the following questions when studying news items where this idea appears. What are the due process claims from the people in question and government authorities? Given the circumstances, what sort of due process does the law and the U.S. Constitution require? Has the government explained what elements of due process the people have received? Remember, if the government is operating legally, its representatives should be able to be quite specific about the procedures that is followed. So be on the lookout for those details. That's where I'd like to conclude today's episode. I'll look forward to sharing more ideas with you next week. And as ever, I appreciate you all out there for tuning in. Take good care, folks, and I'll be back with you soon.